Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm here live today with Dr. Grace Blest-Hopley, and I'm so excited. You're joining us from Jamaica.
Hi, Phoebe. So good to be here. Yep. So my name's Dr. Grace Blest-Hopley. I'm a neuroscientist and psychedelic researcher. Amongst other things, I recently founded the company Hystelica, which is predominantly focused on understanding the safe and efficacious use of psychedelic medicines by women, and that's particularly looking at women's biology and women's bodies and what these medicines look like and feel like for women.
That's just amazing. Like, what an incredible sort of burgeoning field that must feel like as a woman to be part of this, to be championing it. Like, I've known you for a long time, and I just think it's incredible what you're doing. This is so cool. So, recently, have you been able to sort of facilitate people using psychedelic drugs, or?
So I myself am not a facilitator, but through my work, I'm able to get very much involved on the fringes and observe other people and other people's practices through ceremony. Alongside Hystelica, I'm also the research director for a veterans charity called Heroic Hearts Project. And a lot of what we do is take military veterans through ceremonies. And the reason I'm sitting here talking to you from Jamaica is not because I've taken myself on a beautiful holiday, although not a bad place to go, is because I'm actually here with a set of veterans and was sitting in ceremony with them just last night.
Oh, wow, that's so cool.
It was a beautiful ceremony. Yeah, very, very beautiful ceremony. A lot of powerful healing happening in that space.
Wow, no way. That's just fascinating. So, I mean, this is something that I think not very many people have access to. Obviously, it's a classified drug in the UK, and it's sort of something where I think people have a lot of either ignorance and they don't know what psilocybin is or what it does, or kind of like a negative connotation. So, what does psilocybin sort of like do in your brain briefly?
Yeah, sure. So psilocybin is just one of the psychedelic drugs that I researched. It's the one that we've been using here in Jamaica because it's legal to use here in Jamaica. And psilocybin, of course, is derived from the magic mushroom, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. And psilocybin, like other psychedelics, like ayahuasca, which is found in is a brew made from different plants from the Amazon jungle, or ibogaine from a particular plant found in Africa, or peyote taken from the cactus, or LSD synthesized in a lab. They're all what I would determine a classic psychedelic, a classic hallucinogen. And effectively what these substances do is within the brain, they work on the serotonin system. Now, serotonin is the happy drug, the one that makes us feel good and makes us feel connected and to our fellow human beings. And psychedelics work at this receptor to cause a reaction similar to what would be caused when serotonin is acting at this receptor. But they also work at a mirage of other receptors in the brain, to the point where we actually don't fully understand the total complexities of these drugs. But one thing we do know is that when people take these substances, they often experience a perception in the perceived world around them. It's often accompanied with a reduction in fear response, an increase in empathetic feelings, and occasionally hallucinatory visions come, sometimes auditory visions. But generally, you get this increased amount of activation in the brain where different parts of the brain are talking that wouldn't normally. And through that process, through that activation of the brain, that activation of the serotonin receptors, that reduction of fear, that increase of connectedness, people experience this ability to often perceive past things that have happened to them in a totally new light and to gain new insight on those things.
That's just incredible. It's something that because these systems are already in place in our brain to sort of like to sort of to pick these up. it's, I mean, it's a whole other kettle, like a whole other kinds of discussion we could have about whether humans have evolved alongside the use of psychoactive chemicals, because it's, you know, like for example with tetrahydrocannabinoids, like why do we literally have receptors for that in our brains, kind of ready and waiting for it to come along? It's but like I said, that's a whole other, we'll have to do part two, where we'll there's so many you must spend so much time in the rabbit hole, dude. Oh my god. So something I really wanted to discuss with you today was sort of more about the idea of ceremony. So something along the lines of, like, what does ceremony, what I'm trying to say here is people often use psychoactive drugs in a ceremonial setting. I'm thinking about like ayahuasca and what have you. It's sort of steeped in this sort of ritual. And do you think it's important that you know, you can't just sort of like someone give you like ayahuasca in a basement party, and you know, would that affect the way that it do you know what I mean? Like you'd have
I mean, more fool the person who takes ayahuasca in a basement somewhere. It is a very, very powerful substance, with an awful lot of spirituality behind it, and a lot of intention needs to go into the use of it. So talking about psychedelics and ceremony, it is very commonly the way that they're used. And of course, they can be used in other ways and in recreational ways. And we're now seeing them being used and trialed in clinical settings. But one of the key parts of what has been taken forward to the clinical setting has been something from the ceremony. And that is that idea of being facilitated through your journey and facilitated through the experience. Ceremony has been tied into the use of psychedelics for thousands and thousands of years. It's the way that these substances were used in our communities, and it's the way that they
would have had to have been prepared. You would have to, because you know, some of these substances, they need boiling, or they need you know, mashing, and then they need, you know, separating, or whatever kind of sort of like alchemy people are undertaking. So I think there's an idea of like, you know, wait and watch what I do here. So then you'd have, like, you know, there's like you know, first you do this, then you do that, and then in order to do this you must do that. And that's, I think, something that I mean, that obviously is the essence of a ceremony, but that's kind of probably why, is that they, you know, you can't, it's not the sort of thing where you just eat it and it's done. These things sort of need to be synthesized.
I would say that the reason for it is because a lot of these substances were born out of community, and communities that we in the Western world actually wouldn't recognize today. We live very, very separately from our families and our communities. You know, we all live in separate little houses. You know, I live in central London. I've lived in the same house for a long time. I don't know who my neighbors are. That would not have happened if you take it back, you know, talking about where you and I are from, you know, back in England, and then on Britannic soils, there were druids, you know, who would have been the sort of high priests of their communities, who more than likely would have been delivering these ceremonies. And that's definitely the way that they are still delivered in communities that still have these practices. I'm talking, of course, about the tribes of the Amazon jungle here, where I was very, very lucky to recently be and be sitting with those people. So for me, the point of the ceremony is partly because you're right. It's a piece about the ceremony being held and being facilitated and often led by these leaders of the community, but they are not leaders in some political way or anything like that. They're leaders of humanity, and they're in that humanity is health. I think we have this strange idea in our Western world, and it's something that I, as a neuroscientist, very, very clinically trained in what and scientifically trained, I'm just coming to the idea of that within humanity is our health, and when we lose humanity, we lose our health. And so these healers, these sort of medicine men or women, often women, would have been the leaders in the community that take people when they're sick, and that's not just sick of the body, but sick of the mind. And in that ceremony, they are able to come, sit with the shaman or the maestro or the medicine person who is leading, And they are able, through their wisdom, through their many, many, many years of apprenticeships with the people that came before them, to learn how, have that person hold space for them. And within that space, within that ceremony space, that is where the healing happens. That is where the magic happens.
Because almost, I think, with when you trust yourself to that situation, you then surrender. And I think with a lot of psychoactive chemicals, the element of surrender is so important. And I mean, as someone who I gave birth 12 months ago, and I think surrender is what they should just write it on the front of the maternity ward. You do not have control over what's happening to your body at this point. And if you think you do, and if you try to not fight what's happening, but sort of try to manipulate what's happening and try to take control, you're just going to meet like a tidal, it's not even resistance, you are the resistance in a tidal wave of something far greater than you. And I think if you trust yourself to the shaman, and you're like, I've heard good things about you, shaman, I trust myself to you and I surrender, then it takes a lot for some people to do that. Like you said, in the West, people are so used to this individualist mentality of getting to sort of micromanage their own existence. But then, I think as soon as you can, enter the ceremony and have someone hold space for you, I think people are very much like, what do you mean? What do you mean I've got the floor? What do you mean I can relax and I can surrender? I imagine Western people really have a struggle surrendering. If you said, I mean.
Well, I think you've touched on a really good point there, Phoebe. And that is the idea that one of the few places left in our society where we still have people who are there to guide us and support us through that transformative experience is midwives, right? And when people talk to me about doing psychedelic medicine and doing plant medicine and how to do it, would you go off and give birth on your own? Or at least without really, really knowing what you were doing? Probably not. And I would suggest probably a similar attitude needs to be taken to this kind of work. If you are hoping to get a transformative experience.
If you can give birth on your own, I think you must have had a lot of interface with a midwife. Because it's that sort of like, it's that like, I can do this on my own now. I feel like whereas midwives are basically there to, so would you say the shaman of the psychedelic experience is like the midwife of the soul, birthing this new concept into your life, really? So if you're unable to birth this concept yourself through lack of experience, you can go to a soul midwife, a shaman, and they will provide you with this ritual within which you must surrender. There's actually some really good parallels here between the idea of just birthing each other and birthing these new ways of living and these new ideas within yourself that you haven't previously had.
But with that idea, I mean, is that, when you showed up there at the hospital to give birth to your wonderful son, my wonderful godson, and you didn't have to worry about whether or not the gas and air thing was plugged in properly, whether or not the hospital electricity bill had been paid and the lights are going to be kept on, whether or not anyone was going to come into that room and disturb your process. You knew that those people were there to hold space for you to give birth to your baby. And in the same way, when you go into a ceremony, a good ceremony with the right people, with people who really know what they're doing, they should be able to hold that similar space for you. So you can go in there and not have to worry about looking after yourself in the same way that one normally has to look after yourself, checking that no one's going to come and interrupt your process or that you're safe within the space. And you can go internally and focus on the work that needs to be done internal in your body. In the same way as when you're giving birth, you can go inside and focus on that internal space because those people are around you to hold the space.
Yeah, so, absolutely. I mean, do you think there's much of what would you describe as the difference really between like a, situation A where you have like a a ceremony where there is an air of solemnity and order and process, and you feel guided, and you feel, you know, like someone's saying, you can trust me. And then on the other hand, you have exactly the same amount of the same chemical, you know, happening, but then you are in the basement in a party with people that you don't know very well. So like, what's the difference, sort of, you know, from a
Well, when first of all, there's just a safety aspect in terms of these substances do have a physiological effect on the body. And it is important, therefore, that there is somebody responsible who is just watching what's going on, just in case there is a medical emergency. I will preface that with saying that, believe it or not, psychedelic substances are one of the safest substances you can use, far safer than alcohol, far safer than many of the other substances we use in our lives. But there are some risk factors, and often you can become, under the influence of the substances, concerned for your own medical well-being, and it's good to have somebody there that, you know, it's their job to look after you from a medical perspective. So of course there's that. But the other part of it, I would say, is that, I'm trying to think how I can say this in a good way, but if you are in a basement in that way, and you often lose a lot of inhibition, you often lose a lot of understanding for what is sort of the reality immediately around you under the influence of these medicines, and you're very vulnerable. Unfortunately, one of the things that is not the shadow side of this work can be particularly in people being assaulted, occasionally, often sexually assaulted under the influence of these medicines. And if you were to do it in a basement at a party or whatever, perhaps you would put yourself at a higher risk for that. Finally, the idea that these substances go into your body, they work with your own physiology and neurology and neurochemistry in order to somewhat amplify what is going on internally. Now, if you're in a space that feels grungy, that feels unsafe, you will be perceiving that internally. If you then take a huge dose of psychedelic substances in that environment, there is a much, much higher risk that you are going to then experience what we would call a bad trip. Now, sometimes people have bad trips in ceremony, and often what that means is that they are processing through traumas that can be very intense, can be very upsetting, often traumas that person has boxed away, hidden, but they're doing that in that safe container. If you were to try and do that, and say you started to uncover some of those things in a place where you weren't safe, and you really didn't feel safe in your body, that bad trip could become very damaging to your psyche, and what you perceive during that may actually make the trauma worse.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good point. It's almost sort of that the state that you enter is one of vulnerability, and I think that's it, you know, vulnerability doesn't sit well with a lot of people, and I think it takes a lot of inner work in order to you know, it's hard to go into something knowing that you're probably going to meet a, you know, either a version of yourself that you don't like, or you're going to, you know, perhaps sort of remember things that you didn't sort of experience tremendously well. And it's the sort of thing, I think, if people go into it with an idea of you know, like, well, going blind, you know, they don't sort of know what they're in for, then it can I imagine it could be an absolute head fog, really. It sounds like, you know, with great power comes great responsibility, and I think this tool will,
absolutely,
you know, it has the power to do so much. I mean, as someone, I've enjoyed a few psychedelic experiences, and some more notable than others, but just I mean, I'd recommend them to anybody. But for me personally, I love to get, if I'm on a psychoactive chemical, mainly magic mushroom, I love to be outside. I love to be walking, especially like you know, in like forests and what have you, I love to just walk and walk and walk. And I remember thinking to myself many times, going, God, I can walk forever. There's nothing that, I don't feel uncomfortable right now. I just want kind of more stimuli in that, for this particular trip, I wanted more nature in my eyes, so to speak. So like, I think if I were to sit in ceremony and someone were to sort of start maybe asking me sort of questions that, things like, who are you? And I'd be like, whoa, I wasn't prepared for you to ask me that question. I think I always, I tend to look outwardly when I have psychoactive experiences. And I think taking the time to look inwardly, I think is something that, I mean, God, can you imagine what the world would be like if everybody did that?
Yeah, and took the time to really understand who they are. And that is what the ceremony really offers us the opportunity to do, because so often, and this isn't exclusive, of course, to women, but I do find that women often take this role in life where they become the caregivers, and they are the ones who are continually facilitating life for the people around them, for their families, for their communities. And often within that, you're right, it's a very outward experience where you're looking, who can I help? Who needs me in this moment? Whereas sitting in a ceremony gives you the opportunity for the first time to say, you know what? It's not my responsibility to look after anybody else here. And it is one of the first opportunities sometimes people get when they come to these ceremonies. And these don't have to just be psychedelic ceremonies at all. These can be breathwork ceremonies, meditation ceremonies, or ceremonies from many other cultures around the world that don't use psychoactive substances. But they are often some of the first opportunities that people get to sit down and sit with themselves and actually say, who am I? And sometimes that might be a question that is posed.
It's just powerful.
Often it just comes from within.
Yeah, it's something that I feel as though we've had access to this, throughout human history. And I think even though in this age of hyperconnectivity and everybody having access to each other all of the time through the airwaves, I feel as though we have such less like intimate access to the people close to us, and such less intimate access to the contents of our own minds, because we're always outsourcing everything to being like, oh, I want to be distracted by this TV show, or I'm distracted by looking on my phone at some shit I want to buy. Whereas like, I imagine back in the day, obviously for thousands of years, all we had really was a fire, sitting around preparing food together, and then basically looking after each other. Someone had come back from a hunt with a broken arm, and you'd be like, well, yeah, my grandma had to fix a broken arm once and she told me how to do it. It's that sort of I think by knowing so much, I think we know so much less than we did.
Absolutely, I completely agree with you. And sometimes this need, I know I've definitely been guilty of like thinking what you are doing is being incredibly efficient, because I'm going to listen to a podcast while I do 3 other different things, etc., etc. And actually what it is a form of avoidance. You're avoiding yourself. And often that is because, like you said, who am I? The question, who am I? The answer might not be very comfortable. The answer might not be very comfortable given the situation that perhaps you live in, be that because of, the career you're in, your family structure, who society perceives you as. Sometimes to sit with yourself and realize that contradiction between who you are and who the world is can be very, very uncomfortable. And that's why going through a ceremony, going through it with experienced people, experienced healers, their job is to help you through that uncomfortable uncovering sometimes of who you are, and actually allow you. And I've seen it happen many times, of people kind of saying, wow, this is the first time I kind of know who I am.
Absolutely, so powerful stuff. I mean, it must be such a you know, you must have such what I'm saying is, for what you're doing, there must be no telling where this could go for you, really, because I don't think anybody knows what the future of psychedelic medicine is. As like for therapeutic use, is it going to be completely declassified? Is it going to be, because you can't really patent something that kind of pops up every autumn. It's difficult.
Oh, you can, it turns out. I mean, there's plenty of people out there that are looking to do that, and like I said, to patent things and to make some money from it. And just to speak a little bit to that, there is a need for us to prove out these substances when we are going to consider them for the medical treatment of disorders such as treatment-resistant depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, substance use disorder, eating disorders, some autoimmune disorders, I think. There is a definite need, an absolute need, and I would be one of the first to put my hand up and say this is not on if we were to license something through a medical health system that had not been tested for its safety and its efficacy. In order to do that, it's very, very expensive. So I understand the companies that are wanting to do that, feeling the need to protect their investment. So that's that. But that is clinical. That is a clinical model of this. And the clinical model of this is, if those people want to make all that money, then I have my own thoughts on how well it will or won't work in different clinical settings, but that's for them to deal with. What I would like to kind of focus on is the idea of ceremony and the way that we deal with that from just like a wellness and health perspective, about us holistically looking after who we are as human beings. And treating ourselves using these substances in this way is going to take probably more generations than we will stay alive to see to be fully accepted back into our culture. And maybe it won't be. I hope it will move a lot further forward. We know that this was involved in our culture before, but not since the Romans occupied, British territory and burnt all sort of remaining existence of the tribes of our lands, whitewashing out our cultural history. We have not then had an ability to understand what this could look like in our communities. And that's what the really exciting part of this is for me now. What does this look and feel like in 2023, when we've got technology coming out of our ears, we're becoming more and more distant from each other. How do we use this to bring us back? There are people that think that those technologies will help, and I completely agree. But from what I have seen, from what I've experienced, firstly as a neuroscientist, but secondly as a human being, and more importantly as a human being, is that the magic happens when it's a group of living, breathing Homo sapiens sitting around in a circle, chanting, singing, crying together. And I'm not sure how one puts that into a pharmaceutical product or a piece of AI-driven technology or any other, piece of tech that definitely is under development right now as people see the opportunity to commercialize on this practice.
Yeah, it's sort of it's like a fully analog process. It's something that you can't shortcut this, because I think by trying to truncate what the idea of a ceremony and to consume psychedelic medicine and have like to journey in that way within the self and to hold space for other people, I think there's just as much to be learned by holding space for other people having that experience.
Yes.
About one's own self. You can have I can think of a time in my life where I've enjoyed psychoactive chemicals with friends, and the sort of the energies moving between people in the room absolutely floored me, and I was unprepared for this, for for the dialogue that happened, that was complete, that I was just a bystander for. You know, it's just really really powerful stuff. So like you say, I think if they're going to move ahead with, you know, the future of it being sort of under this like capitalist umbrella, I think I'm really interested to see how it plays out in terms of how are they going to manage to, you know, to not let that spark out, because that spark is what you need. Do you know what I mean? Like, but you can't sort of
Yeah.
have somebody in a cubicle and just be like, you know, you have this, you'll feel better in a couple of. It just doesn't. You know, it's like you can throw loads of shit at the wall, but some of it ain't gonna stick.
Yeah. Well, also, you know, it condenses the whole experience down to, oh, this is going to be 6 hours in a clinic, or now we've got the drugs to a shorter acting. We can do it in 4. We can do it in 2.
Yeah.
But that's not what it looks like. When I look, you know, I'll talk about my experience now with Heroic Hearts and watching now hundreds of veterans who really, really have struggled and often been through many of the conventional treatments for post-traumatic stress disorder and failed. And what it looks like when these people really gain from this, really get long-term, meaningful, lasting changes and improvements in their health and well-being, is when they engage with the process. And when I talk about the process, we keep talking about ceremony here, but the ceremony starts way, way, way before you even set foot on the land where it's going to take place. And it continues way, way, way after you leave that space. In terms of the preparation that one does to come to the space, that is sort of thinking about, why am I coming? Often when we look at particular cultures that still use this medicine, they have certain diets, or dietas as they call them, where they impose, you know, changing what you are consuming so that you do it in a much more mindful and intentional way prior to going in. That starts to not only kind of cleanse the body of toxins and all the other things, but mainly, you know, it's a concerted effort by you. You have to put it in. If you want to heal, I think we've got a little bit used to fast medicine. I want to take a pill and I want it to be done. Well, I'm afraid if you want to heal your psyche, that's just not how it's going to work. You need to put in that effort beforehand. You then need to go through the process of the ceremony, and then afterwards going through that integrative process. And that integrative process is the rest of your life.
Absolutely. I mean, honestly, Grace, I could talk to you about this forever. This is the most interesting subject, and it's so close to my heart, so dear to my heart, as are you. I can't thank you enough for coming to talk with me today. We have to do another one of these. I've got so many questions for you. I would just love to fall down the rabbit hole with you further and ever on.
Absolutely. And I would love to come and talk a bit more about the science and a bit more about, you know, what this really looks like in the body. But I hope we've just sort of managed to touch on a broader aspect of what this looks and feels like, and give people some thinking points about what a ceremony might mean or look like for them. And thank you, Phoebe, for giving me the opportunity to come and talk about it.
No, please, it's just been an absolute dream. I hope you have a really nice time on the rest of your work away in Jamaica. And thank you so much. Dr. Grace, everybody.
Thank you.